This morning, I'm talking about transformative listening. How can the practice of deep listening transform our lives, our relationships, and the world we live in? Listening is an interesting challenge in our modern world, and listening to change has its own particular nuances and things that can get in the way. I think these days, more and more, bless you, we tend to live in echo chambers, right? It's really easy to tune out anyone who has a different opinion. It's really easy on social media, on the news, on even newspapers, and the communities that we gather in to only be listening to voices that are similar and opinions that are similar to our own. And that's dangerous, right? Because it limits our understanding of the world. It confines our ability to grow unless we are bumping against things that are different than what we know and understand in the world. It's easy to fall into something called confirmation bias, right? Where we think we already know what someone is going to say, and so that's what we hear them saying. One of my favorite junk books to read is called Ethan of Athos. Has anyone ever heard of it? No. Ooh, good. I won't spoil it completely, but a little bit of a spoiler alert. It's a space drama where there's a man who comes from a world that is populated only by men. Right? Yeah. They have cryo chambers where they raise embryos that they have created. The technology has advanced so far that they can grow babies artificially, but they still have to have donor eggs. And all of a sudden, their supply of donor eggs is dying. So this man who has been raised in a society where he has only ever known men is sent forth into the galactic community to find volunteers to donate their eggs to his world. You can imagine how difficult a task this must be. And the things that he might encounter that he would never have expected or known, like a woman hitting on him. How strange would that be? But because it's a space drama and it's a book, not only does he encounter strange things, but he happens to get wrapped up in an espionage ring where people assume that he is trying to complete this big plot. And they keep thinking that he is part of a genetic engineering program that they need to interrupt. And the people who really are part of that program happen to be on the same space station. And it gets very complicated very quickly. But everyone is assuming that everyone else has the same understanding of the world. And it leads to a lot of antics and a lot of confusion. And some hurt along the way as well. Now, in real life, it can lead to even more hurt when we go into a conversation with someone who has a different view of the world or a different understanding of the world, and we assume that they are coming from the same standpoint as we are, from the same assumptions and culture and background, the same experiences. If we hear them say something that doesn't quite fit, we make up our own stories about where that might come from. Or we just get darn confused. What if I say, Shaka when the walls fell? I'm getting or Temba, his arms wide open. Or if I say, Uzani's army with fists open. Sokath, his eyes uncovered. All right, I'm going too far. I can tell my Trekkies in the room. In Star Trek The Next Generation, there's an episode in season 5, episode 2, called Darmok, where the way that the people in this episode communicate with each other is by referencing stories. So when they say, Shaka, when the walls fell, they all understand the reference, the story, and it conveys not only information, but it conveys emotion and feeling and history and culture all in that one phrase. But Picard and his crew have no idea what this history is and what it is they're referencing, and so they're just confused by this until they figure it out and can decipher using the stories and begin to have a conversation in their own language, rooted and grounded in the experience of these people. Too often that happens with us in our lives when we encounter someone new. We either don't realize how different they are from us, or we write them off and say, well, I can't understand what they're talking about, so I'm just going to go about in my own life. It takes real effort and time to sit with a person or walk with a person or be and eat with people to learn who we are, to learn the nuances of one another's lives. I don't know about you, but I only have so many spoons in my life, only so much energy on each given day. And I have to ask myself, who do I want to spend that time with? I challenge you to ask yourselves as well, who are the people in your life that are worth spending the extra time with to hear those stories? Now, in my training to become a minister, I was blessed to be able to take a course called Multicultural Congregations, where we went to Tulsa, Oklahoma for a week. And there I learned about the race massacre in the Greenwood district. I see a few heads nodding. At one point it was called the Black Wall Street, and I had never heard of it because it was wiped off the map in a riot where white folks came in and decimated the city, decimated the area, killed many folks, and left most of the rest homeless or arrested. I didn't have that cultural reference, even though I grew up in this country and learned about civil rights. Those stories were never told to me. During that week, I also had the chance to listen to my colleagues. We broke into caucus groups. I always felt a little awkward about caucusing, particularly by something like race. I'm like, I want to hear other people's opinions. Why would I want to be in a group of other white people listening to only what they have to say and only sharing with them? But during that week, I discovered the importance and the power of caucusing. And I was able to translate my own experience of being part of a bisexual support group that was different than being just in the LGBT community, and certainly different than having a group of allied and queer folks together. I was able to translate that into these conversations on race. And to really sit with my white colleagues and hear their stories and unpack my own. hearing about folks who were wrestling with their family's history of racism, the atrocities that their ancestors and even their current living family members had and were committing. Wrestling with the unknowns in my history. I have family who came over on the Mayflower. Even if they did not directly participate in atrocities, they did by being part of the system and being white in America. And I know for as much as I try every day to be supportive, to be an ally, to be woke, I'm not all the way there. I never will be. I'll always be unpacking and listening and learning new things. Near the end of the week, we did what's called a fishbowl, where those of us who had identified in the White Caucus sat around the outside of the room in a circle, and those who had identified as the people of color sat in the center. And the folks in the center had a conversation with each other. And we around the outside were not allowed to participate. We were not allowed to comment. We were not allowed to bring our own self into the conversation, but rather we were blessed to be able to listen and listen deeply while they had a conversation with one another about their own experiences. Let me tell you, some of those experiences rocked me and taught me how to listen more deeply and the things that I was missing when I tried to have a conversation instead of inviting space for sacred witness and deep listening. At the same time, I could feel my own nervous system through all of those conversations and that whole week flaring up. These conversations that we need to have, this listening we need to do, triggers so many things in us. It's really easy for our nervous systems to hit that we're in danger mode. Even if we don't realize that's there, because of our lived experiences and the generational trauma that lives in each of us, to sit and listen deeply also means to be able to regulate our own nervous systems, to recognize when the fight, the flight, the fawn, or the freeze are coming up in us, and figure out how to work it out of our bodies, whether that's a little stimming, whether that's some deep breathing, whether it's repeating the mantra of I am safe to ourselves. Deep listening takes hard work internally for us to truly be present to difficult conversations that can create change. Part of why these conversations are so important is to really make change. We need to be able to listen to each other and listen to those of us who are in an oppressed situation so that we can make change that is needed. Out of the disabilities movement came a phrase in the 1990s, first spoken during the South African disability rights movement, called "Nothing about us without us." I'm going to repeat that if you haven't heard the phrase yet. Nothing about us without us. Meaning, if we are making change that is intended to help people, if we are lobbying for something new, if we are making change in this congregation about how we set up our AV, that we don't make assumptions, but we actually go and talk and listen to the people who are calling for change, to the people who are needing things to be different, the people who are being oppressed or marginalized. And that people is us sometimes, and sometimes it is people we don't know yet. But to make change that is lasting, that is authentic, that truly moves us towards a beloved community that embraces all. We need to hold that phrase, nothing about us without us. Now, this sermon took a different bent than I intended earlier in the week. I was going to talk about politics and listening to the people who have very different moral values than we do and who are still struggling with deciding how to vote their morals. But I started asking myself, where do I have the energy? Where do I have the connections already in place? Now, some of us have family who have those very different beliefs, who don't uphold the humanity of every person in the ways that we vote. And I encourage you to have those deep listening conversations with them as well. But for me, I'm getting ready to leave on Monday to go to another gathering of colleagues where we will be learning together about transitional ministry and congregations in transition, which honestly is every congregation right now. We are all transitioning as the world changes so quickly. But I'm going to Montgomery, Alabama. So I'm getting ready to listen to more stories of the civil rights era, getting ready to wrestle with how did they make change, what were they facing, what is my role and history within that context. And so I'm asking myself the questions of whose voices am I giving energy to? Whose voices am I centering? What change am I trying to make? What relationships do I want to invest my time in? Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in little moments and little conversations. It happens like drops of water building up over time until they wear away the banks or sometimes dramatically break a dam. But where do each of us want our drops of water in this world to fall? I invite you this week to ask yourself, who in my life can I sit with and invite into a conversation of deep listening with one another? How can I hold myself open to hear their truth that may come from a very, very different place? And perhaps for some of you, who can you invite into deep listening that might be ready to hear your story? Who may feel safe to share with? I will leave you to ponder on that. And next week you'll get a chance to practice deep listening during the service and sharing with one another.